All right, it's time for us to get started. My phone shows it's 7. Clock says it's 7:02. That's the opposite of having Terry one for another time. I don't know, have y'all ever been familiar with that? Some congregations, they will, at least some that I have been to, whoever sets the clock will intentionally set it, about 5 minutes behind. And that's, Terry one for another time. So, whoever, if whoever is up, is wanting to start right on time, they're actually starting 5 minutes behind. Give everybody a chance to get settled in. All right, we're in Daniel chapter 3. And before we jump into that, let's start with a word of prayer. Righteous Heavenly Father, thank you so much for the gifts that you've given us today. We thank you especially for gathering us in this place to study from your word. I pray, Father, that our study will be fruitful, that we will learn from these three friends how we ought to conduct ourselves in the faith. Father, thank you for watching over them and watching over us as you watch over them. Father, help our faith to be like theirs. Help us to understand their faith so that we can understand the faith better. Holy Father, thank you for the gifts that you've given us in your Son. Thank you for his ministry. Thank you for the forgiveness that we have through his atoning sacrifice. And thank you, Father, for the hope that we have in the resurrection. In Jesus' name that we pray. Amen. Okay. So, we finished off on Sunday talking about the accusation that these Chaldeans had made. And remember, in the ancient Near East, it's common practice that if you accuse somebody of blasphemy, and they are found to be a blasphemer, then as a reward you get their stuff, right? Because you have outed a blasphemer, which saves the land from blasphemy. And so the Chaldeans, they have got some interest in this accusation that they're bringing up to Nebuchadnezzar. Excuse me. Now, at the end of the chapter, they get their comeuppance. And so we'll return to that at the end of the chapter. They get what is coming to them. Let's start in verse 13. Now that the Chaldeans have levied their accusation against Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, King Nebuchadnezzar is going to act. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in a furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now if you're ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the golden image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" All right, Nebuchadnezzar obviously is outraged at their response, because again, this whole thing is set up as a loyalty play. All right, the point is not just to enforce a particular type of idol worship, but to enforce loyalty to the king. And so the king is furious whenever he finds that 3 of his top officials are not loyal to him. Because that's what this is. They're not just infidels in his eyes. They are disloyal. And it's especially important that these 3 be loyal to him, because they're not just over any province, they're over the capital province, the province of Babylon. So to have 3 men this high up be disobedient is a scandal to Nebuchadnezzar. And because this is a loyalty play, because he does not want to have to replace these 3 men in this position, he gives them another chance. He says, "We're going to strike up the band again, and if you're ready..." And by the way, you can kind of notice the sarcasm in this. If you are ready when you hear the sound of the horn, etc., bow down and worship. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. Like, we're all waiting on you 3. We get your act together. So he's, in a sense, even though he's threatening to throw them in a furnace and kill them, he's being kind of magnanimous here. Because the threat has already been made by the herald. The herald has already told everybody, this is the punishment if you don't bow down to this image. And Nebuchadnezzar is repeating himself to these three men. The question that he asks at the very end, who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? I think this is the key statement of the chapter, because this is where Nebuchadnezzar throws the gauntlet down and reveals what this contest is about and who this contest is between. It's between him and between whatever God that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego claim to follow. And the force of the question is, what God is there out there who would be willing to save you out of my hands? You got to remember that Nebuchadnezzar is a pagan. He's not necessarily stating that there is no God out there that could rescue Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But Nebuchadnezzar doesn't believe that in his eyes, any lesser God would be willing to attempt a rescue of the Judeans, since they have refused to honor his, in his eyes, more powerful gods. Anyway, this is the way that the pagan mind operates. Pagans are, being polytheistic, they're kind of agnostic about things. They think that there are many gods, and that they don't know all of the gods. And so Nebuchadnezzar is willing to think that, well, maybe there's a God out there that they worship. He's not trying to claim that there is no, that whoever they worship doesn't exist. But if he does exist, obviously this God must be less powerful than the God that I worship. All right, because Nebuchadnezzar, as the king of his nation, represents his God. Right, that's the pagan mindset when it comes to kingship, is that the king is the representative of his God on earth. All right, and in representing the state, he's also representing his God. All right, there's no separation of church and state. The pagan god that they worship is the patron of their entire country. And the king is representative of the country, between the country and God, and between the God and the country. And the king expresses the will of that God and exercises the power of that God on earth. And so in Nebuchadnezzar's mind, his God is the big bad in the neighborhood. Because consider what all Nebuchadnezzar's God has done for him in Nebuchadnezzar's mind. And again, this is just stating what Nebuchadnezzar thinks going into this. The Babylonian Empire, to become an empire, first had to defeat the Assyrian Empire, which, before Babylon got powerful, Assyria was the big kid on the block. Right? And so for Babylon to defeat Assyria meant that the Babylonian gods must be incredibly powerful. Right? Because the Assyrian gods must have been incredibly powerful for them to wield the sort of power that they had and have the kind of empire that they had. The Assyrians must have had very powerful gods, and so, for as Babylonians to go and defeat them, that means our gods must be extremely powerful. And then, at the Battle of Carchemish, just shortly before the events of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar defeats the big kid of big kids, the empire that everybody feared in the ancient Near East. The empire that had been a strong empire, back when your empire wasn't even a twinkle in your God's eye. Right? Egypt. Egypt has been around forever. They've been strong as long as anybody can remember. And of course they are famous for their pantheon. Right? They're just as pagan as everybody else in the area. And Nebuchadnezzar beat Egypt at Carchemish. And so in his mind, his gods are as powerful as they can get. And he is the representative of his God. All right? And by the way, that's the sign that Nebuchadnezzar is honoring his God, is that he's been so successful. That if he succeeds, he must have his God's power behind him. and his God must be powerful for him to be winning. And so he lays down this challenge: who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? In his estimation, there's no God that could do it. There's no God that's powerful enough to take on his gods. And so the intent here is he's kind of rubbing Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah's faces in it. And by the way, remember, they're referred to as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego all throughout this chapter. It's a constant reminder: we won, we won, we won, you lost. All right? By giving them their Babylonian names, it's a reminder that they lost and their God lost in the Babylonian way of thinking. Yes. Yeah, and if you jump on YouTube, one of the first classes that we did in the series explains the meaning of all of their names. And it's atrocious. All of their Hebrew names honor Israel's God. And their Babylonian names honor Babylonian gods. And so I personally cannot imagine the indignity of having my name changed to something like Meshach. Sure.
All right, last Thursday, I watched the video on these Bibles.
Right. Yeah, we answered your question about where is Daniel in all this. Yeah.
All right. Chapter 1, verse 7.
Nebuchadnezzar. Yes.
Was a pagan.
Yes, Belteshazzar.
So, it's possible that he's standing there.
It is possible, yeah.
You said that Daniel does fall sometimes.
It is, so the text doesn't tell us. That's the thing. The text is not interested in when God's people are unfaithful, because the assumption already is that they have been. That's why they're in this situation. And in fact, Daniel chapter 9 is going to be one long confession of how faithless they've been. So the text isn't interested in showing us where God's people fall off on the faith. It's interested in showing us how Nebuchadnezzar sets up his human empire against God, and how Daniel and these three friends stand up against that, how they are faithful to God. So all of that is to say, whenever the text doesn't tell us what Daniel is doing, it really could be wide open. It could mean anything. It may mean he's not here and that he doesn't break faith, or it might mean that he actually is there and that he has broken faith, and that we just need to be open to that as an option. So, does that get to what you were wondering about?
Yeah.
Yeah, because he does receive a pagan name, Belteshazzar, goddess save the king. And that's going to come up again in the next chapter as well. Nebuchadnezzar is going to point it out that his name is Belteshazzar. So, let's see. Oh, no, you're fine. So the king has laid down the gauntlet here. All right, who's the God that's going to deliver you out of my hands? And the intent here is to taunt them. Right? Because Nebuchadnezzar's God has won in his eyes. So it's designed to make fun of them for their God having lost, and to dissuade them from trusting in that God to save them. And so this is a fundamental challenge to their faith. Are you going to trust your God, who in the pagan way of seeing things has already lost? Are you going to trust the loser God to get you out of this situation? Are you going to trust the loser God to save you from the representative of the winner God? And in Nebuchadnezzar's calculus, that's a bet that's just not going to work out. And in fact, all the way along, he thinks that he has the upper hand here. Yeah, exactly. I mean, he sees them go into the furnace. He thinks, all right, that's it. That's done. We don't even need to set a timer on this thing. It's done. All right? There is a parallel here, by the way. Daniel is constantly connecting his stories together just to show that there is a constant thread between all of these stories. Even though they're all self-contained episodes, they're all connected. The king here is challenged. Who is the God that can deliver you out of my hands? You might remember in chapter 2... Let's see. If we go back to verse 10 in chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar, is wanting his Chaldeans to reveal the dream and interpret it to him. And they say, well, just tell us the dream. He says, no, you tell me the dream and interpret it. And they go back and forth for a while, and in verse 10, the Chaldeans answered the king and said, there is not a man on earth who can meet the king's demand, for no great or powerful king has asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. The thing that the king asks is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh. In other words, there's not anybody, there's no God who's going to show this. Right? The gods could, but they're not going to, is what the Chaldeans say. That's kind of the same idea that is behind Nebuchadnezzar's challenge here. Under normal circumstances, your God might have been able to save you from some normal thing, but he's not going to come out for you now. So you might as well just get in line. We're going to strike up the band again. You fall down and worship, and everything will be okay. Now look at the friends' response. Starting in verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar. By the way, as we're reading this, think how you would react to, say, one of your kids if they talk to you this way. O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. All right, we noted on Sunday that at the outset, the three friends are very quiet in their rebellion against Nebuchadnezzar. They do not shout it from the rooftops, hey, what's going on here is wrong and we will take no part in it because we are the holy people of God. They don't do that. They simply keep their faith. They disobey. But as soon as it becomes an issue between them and the king, then they get vocal. All right, can you imagine if you tell your kid to do something, Mom, I have no need to answer you in that. You stop that yakking or I start the smacking, right? And that's basically Nebuchadnezzar's response, right? He is filled with fury at them for this response. And it's kind of the force behind it. We have no need to answer you in this matter. And regardless of what happens, be it known to you, O king, and there's some sass there, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. We are not going to do what you want us to do, regardless of what happens. All right, so the three friends are unequivocal in their response. There is no doubt what they think of Nebuchadnezzar's God and what they think of Nebuchadnezzar's request to worship his God. Not going to happen. They do have faith. Now, I want us to talk about the nature of their faith. All right, I've been reading from the English Standard Version. Look in verse 17. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. Who has a different translation here? What other translations do we have represented here? American Standard? What's the American Standard say for verse 17?
If it so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hands.
Okay, so basically the same thing. If this be so, or if it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us, and he will deliver us. Okay. Any other translations? Anybody have the King James or the New King James? New King James? How does the New King James read? Okay. As you're looking at your Bibles, all of these translations have this difficulty to them. When they say, if this be so, or if that is the case, what are they talking about? If what is the case? If what be so? What are they referring to?
It says we are thrown into the blazing furnace. God whom we serve.
Interesting.
Mine's
New Living Translation? Okay. And I've got to say, at that point, at the beginning of verse 17, the New Living Translation has just completely made that up. That's not what the three friends are saying to King Nebuchadnezzar, if you throw us into the burning fiery furnace. The reason why all of our translations are a little wonky at this point is because the most straightforward reading of the original here, as I understand it, and as I've read others explain it, the three friends... Sorry?
It goes on. It says,
Right.
will rescue us from your power.
Right. But none of our translations have gotten what condition they're actually calling into question. The most straightforward translation of this text is, if our God whom we serve exists, He is able to save us. Now, the reason why most of our English translations don't frame it that way is if you just read that little bit, it sounds like they're calling God's existence into question, which they're not. They're absolutely not doing that. But in English, it kind of sounds that way, doesn't it, if we phrase it that way? If our God whom we serve exists, He is able to save us. Especially, and that gives us trouble, especially when we get to the but if not. Because then we start thinking that the if not refers back to God existing and that they're questioning God's existence. That's not what's going on in this text. So let me give you another rendering of this text. If our God whom we serve exists, He is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. So may He deliver us out of your hand, O King. Right, and that's the second part of what they said. All of our translations translate the verb in the second half of the sentence, He will deliver us out of your hand, O King, as an indicative verb, just a statement of fact. This is the way it is going to happen. Just a simple future tense verb. He will save us. He will deliver us out of your hand, O King. Well, this is actually not a translation that I have seen represented among English translations. This is one that I've gotten out of a commentator. But the verb that is used there, it can be used as an indicative, but it can also be used as another verb voice that we call jussive, which in English would be rendered, so may He deliver us out of your hand, O King. They're not stating that He will. It's more like a prayer. May He deliver us out of your hand. And so the but if not refers back to whether God's going to deliver them out of His hand. All right, so let's get the full force of what they're saying here. If our God whom we serve exists, He is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. So may He deliver us out of your hand, O King. But if not, be it known to you, O King, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. So what they're doing at the beginning is they're merely stating the condition. If God exists, He can save. Is that true? Yeah. If the God of Israel exists, He can save. That's in His nature. That's what He tells us.
But if He decides to do so.
Yeah, it all hinges on His decision. So if He exists, yeah, He's capable of saving us. And so what they do whenever they say, so may He deliver us out of your hand, O King, is they're abiding by the law here. You're not to put the Lord your God to the test. Now, that's a principle in the law. If you go back to, maybe we read this in a number of places, but Deuteronomy chapter 6 is one place. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 16, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test as you tested him at Massah. Deuteronomy 6:16. You shall not put the Lord your God to the test as you tested him at Massah. Massah is also known as Meribah. That is the place where Israel tested the Lord by demanding water. Remember, if Israel gets out in the wilderness and they start questioning God's intent for them, did God really mean to save us? Why did He drag us out here? We were eating melons. We were having a good time in Egypt. How short their memories are. Right? Things were good for us in Egypt, besides the backbreaking labor in the slavery. But we had watermelon, And so they put God to the challenge. That's what it means to put God to the test. In fact, that's what Satan is doing to Jesus when he tempts him in the wilderness. If you are the Son of God, turn these stones into bread. If you're the Son of God, cast yourself down from this high place and the angels will deliver you. Israel says, if God is who He says He is and He really has our interests at heart, then give us some water. We're thirsty. All right? And fellas, think about it this way. What if you were sitting at home and your darling wife turned to you and said, if you really loved me, you'd go get me a glass of water right now. Would you do that? Well, only suckers do that. Everybody knows that.
While you're up.
Yeah. I mean, the correct answer to that is, woman, go make me a sandwich. Right? No. The correct answer is you don't just get up and go get the glass of water. Right? That's not what you do. And that's basically what Israel is doing to God. And in a lot of our translations, that's what they have Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah doing here in Daniel chapter 3. Just reading from the ESV again. If this be so, this, who knows what it is. But whatever it is, if it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and He will deliver us out of your hand, O King. All right, they're just stating that outright, at least in a lot of our English translations. He will deliver us out of your hand. That's putting God to the test. But if not, okay, so we're not putting God to the test. Be it known to you, O King, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. So what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are doing here is they're not putting God to the test. They're saying, God can save us out of your hand. If it's God's will, then you're not going to destroy us in that burning fiery furnace. That may not be His will. It may be that we burn to a crisp in that burning fiery furnace. It doesn't matter. We know what's right. We are not going to bow down to this idol that you've put in front of us. Right? And that is the nature of their faith. And that, I think, ought to be the nature of our faith. To have it on faith that God is able to do whatever we ask of Him, but He is not beholden to us. Right? We're not going to sit down and say to Him, get me a glass of water, and expect Him to be at our beck and call like some sucker. Again, Nebuchadnezzar is the one who thinks that they worship a sucker God. They don't. They know that they worship the true and living God. And so they're not putting Him to the test, and neither should we as we live in faith to Him. But regardless of what God chooses to do in His holiness and His righteousness, we're going to do what we know to be right. Right? And that should be the nature of our faith. We know that God can do whatever we ask of Him, but it may not be in His will to do what we ask of Him. Whatever the Lord does, we're going to do what we know is right for us to do, and not make demands on the Lord. So that is one thing that the three friends are doing in this statement to Nebuchadnezzar. Another thing that they're doing is they're following some broader strategy here to really pin it to Nebuchadnezzar. We've already noted that they've given Nebuchadnezzar a lot of sass in this response. We have no need to answer you in this matter. Be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you've set up. But there's something else that they're doing here. When they say, if our God whom we serve exists, but if not, they're pacing Nebuchadnezzar. In other words, they are answering Nebuchadnezzar using the same phrasing that he used in talking to them. And I'm sure any of us that have had kids, you've had it done to you, right? Sometimes your kid will talk back to you, kind of mockingly in the same tone and in the same rhythm that you talked to them. Yeah. Go pick up your room, Junior. Okay, Dad. You can pick up the sass just in the tone and in the pacing and everything. Notice the way that Nebuchadnezzar frames his response. Notice the way he frames his response. Whenever he gives them the initial command. Now, if you are ready, when you hear the band struck up, and you fall down and worship the image that I've made, well and good. All right, now, if you are ready, and you do all this, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And their response is, well, Nebuchadnezzar, if our God whom we serve exists, He's able to save us from you. So may He save us from you. But if not, then know this, we're not going to serve your gods anyway. All right, so they just answered him back using the same sort of phrasing that he used to make his commands on them. So they are really thumbing their noses at him hard in their response to him here. And they're also changing the subject on him. Nebuchadnezzar up to this point has been obsessed with power. His power relative to their power, and by extension the power of his God over and against the power of their God. What they're doing is they're shifting the topic to the existence of the gods. If our God exists, He's able to save us. Nebuchadnezzar had not at any point in this conversation called any God's called any God's existence into question. What they are doing by framing this in terms of the existence of the gods is that they're subtly calling the existence of His God into question. They're calling this whole affair into question. Because the obvious answer to their condition, if our God exists, is that they believe He exists. Otherwise they wouldn't be attached to following His command. The real question is, does your God exist, Nebuchadnezzar? The one that you're trying to get us to bow down to. They do it subtly. That's the force of the language here. And so notice, just again, how they have turned on a dime here. How they go from being completely quiet in their rebellion to going full-on thumb the nose at Nebuchadnezzar. They are standing their ground firmly now that it's come to it. All right, but they didn't jump straight to this. All right, they had this kind of sass and they had this kind of wit available to them all the time. They didn't deploy it until they were put to it. Right, but before they were put to it, they were content just to be faithful in quiet and in private. Right, any questions up to this point?
They do go through the fire, because we went through. How does Nebuchadnezzar look at the God? He thinks another pagan God that serves.
Yeah, the short answer to that is yes. Nebuchadnezzar is a pagan. And when we get to the next passage that we're going to read, reading verses, well, we'll just read through the end of the chapter, starting in verse 19. But when we get to his observation that he sees a fourth man walking around there in the furnace, the description, let's see. Verse 25. Let's go ahead and read this one. He answered and said, "But I see 4 men unbound walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the appearance of the 4th is like..." All right, now, what do your translations say?
A son of the gods.
A son of the gods. All right, that's
ESV.
Yeah, that's the reading of the ESV.
Looks like a god.
Looks like a god. All right, that's New Living Translation. Anything else? Anything different? Anybody have the King James or the New King James? Now, do they capitalize the S on son?
No.
Okay. There's the King James, if I remember right, the Old King James typically does capitalize the S. And what the King James and the Old King James do there is they do the interpreting for us. That they have Nebuchadnezzar seeing the pre-incarnate Christ in the furnace with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And historically among interpreters, there's been some debate as to if that's what Nebuchadnezzar saw, and that's an option. From Nebuchadnezzar's perspective, he is not all of a sudden becoming a pre-Christian Christian here.
Mine has a star beside
What's your note say?
it. It says, like a son of the gods.
Yes, that is...
Go either way.
Yeah, that's the... more than likely the best reading of this text. You can read it, the Son of God. Like you can translate it that way. You can translate it, a son of the gods. Knowing Nebuchadnezzar's faith up to this point, more than likely he is expressing a pagan belief here, a son of the gods.
The King James Version does have it capitalized.
Yeah, the Son of God. Yeah, and that's, that is a viable translation. We'll talk about whether it's a viable interpretation. Again, that's something that some interpreters of Daniel have held to. Some believe that it is just an angel of the Lord who has appeared in the furnace with them. Regardless, what happens is that God goes in and saves them. Yeah. God sends either His Son or His messenger, an angel, into the fiery furnace and saves them from it. All right, let's go ahead and read the whole text. Starting in verse 19. "Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, 'Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?' They answered and said to the king, 'True, O king.'" What else do you say to the king other than yes? He answered and said, "But I see 4 men unbound walking in the midst of the fire, and they're not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." All right, we'll stop there for right now. As we look at the punishment here, the first thing that we read is Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The same word that's translated face here in the ESV is image. That his image changed towards them. Yeah, well, and he's outraged. But his image has changed. And notice this whole conflict has been around the image. The image that Nebuchadnezzar set up. And now, instead of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego responding to Nebuchadnezzar's image, now Nebuchadnezzar's image, his face, is responding to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The tables have turned here already. And it's important that we note this, that the tables have turned at this point. The tables don't turn later in the chapter, whenever it's apparent that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are not dead. The tables turn immediately once they profess their faith, and they assert their faith against the idols of Nebuchadnezzar. That's when the tables turn. Let's see, the furnace is ordered to be 7 times hotter. Obviously, this is not something that Nebuchadnezzar intends literally. The Babylonians did not have some early, commercial thermometer that they could use in their burning fiery furnaces. It's a euphemism for get it as hot as it will go. Fan those billows as fast as you can. It's kind of like when we use in our own language the expression the whole 9 yards. Right? It literally, at one point, meant 9 yards of fabric used in making a kilt. Right? But none of us talk about kilt making anymore. For whatever reason, we've lost that. And we use it instead to mean the whole thing. Whatever it is, all of it. That's what we mean by the whole 9 yards. 7 times hotter means essentially that in terms of heat. Make it as hot as it will go. And I only call that detail out here because we need to start getting used to, in Daniel, the use of symbolic numbers. All right, that's going to get a lot more important later on in Daniel, but it's important for us to notice that this is not just something weird that Daniel does during the vision sections of the book. This is just baked into language. Right? We use metaphors all the time. We use symbolic language all the time. And we use numbers in that symbolic language all the time. And Daniel is using it here, or Nebuchadnezzar rather, is using it here in a pretty innocuous way. And nobody gets into any big fights into what the 7 times hotter signifies. This represents the 7 churches of Asia. We don't get into any fights about that.
There's a lot of sevens in the Bible.
Oh yeah, there are a ton of 7s. And that's why 7 is a common number to represent totality. Which is why he says 7 times hotter instead of 10 times hotter. We would say 1,000,000 times hotter. Right? It means as hot as it gets. Alright, notice how swiftly Nebuchadnezzar reacts against the 3 friends and how urgent his reaction is. Alright, so we've already noticed the tables have turned in this regard, but this all happens so quickly that they're not even stripped down to be thrown into the furnace. They are bound in their clothes to be thrown in, and the furnace is heated so quickly that the mighty men that are used to take them up to the mouth of the furnace are consumed by the flame. Yes. Yeah, they burned up. And the 3 friends still end up going in. It's because most, like ancient furnaces that would be used for like making bricks or smelting, things like that, would have 2 entrances, like 2 holes in them. First off, it's for airflow, but you would lower the material down through a hole in the top. So you'd have like a big earthen structure, and you would have some scaffolding up to the top, and you would lower the material to be smelted or whatever, baked, in through the top, and then the flames would be stoked. Air could come in through a side entrance. And usually things were situated so that then you could take like a long rod or something and poke it in through the side entrance, grab whatever it is you're making, and pull it out through the side. Right, once they're in the furnace, they're untied. Whether that's something that comes from the Lord or if it's just the heat of the fire that burns their bonds away, they are released from their bondage in the furnace. But that detail about the hole at the top, that's how they fall in. Right? You would think if they were just walking in the entrance and the guards die, well, why don't Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego just stop? But they go in. And Nebuchadnezzar, by the way, notice again how things have flipped here. Right? Everything happens so quickly that the furnace is overheated. They're tied up in their clothes. Nebuchadnezzar, remember, his expectation up to this point has been that everybody is to bow down to this graven image immediately. We strike up the band, you bow down. Right? There should be an immediate response. Now, they have him acting that quickly. Right? They're supposed to be the ones acting lickety-split. Now he's the one acting lickety-split. And the death of the soldiers here is an important reversal. Right? Because they certainly expected, to be rewarded for their loyalty to the king. Right? That's the way things work. If you do what the king says, you get rewarded. Well, now these men who are loyal to the king have lost their lives for that loyalty.
We think the Nebuchadnezzar would thought his pagan god would say,
Yeah, if this would have worked anyway in Nebuchadnezzar's view, it should be his God saving his men instead of the three friends' God saving the three friends. So things have been reversed here. These men who have been loyal to the king suffer death, and the ones who have rebelled against the king, their life is preserved. All right. I'd hope to get things wrapped up tonight, but we will, Lord willing, wrap things up on Sunday and jump into chapter 4. So thank you so much for your attention and your comments tonight.